Everyone in that room believed I had given $15,000 as a gift for my sister's wedding. They said it with such confidence, as if my generosity was so obvious that questioning it would be absurd. My parents bragged about it, cousins whispered about it, and even distant relatives I barely knew nodded in approval when they heard the figure. The room buzzed with admiration for what they thought was my big, selfless act. But here's the truth. I had never given a single penny. Not a cent. The number they were flaunting, the image they were painting, was entirely fabricated. For some, it was amusing. For me, it was infuriating. It started long before the wedding, back when invitations went out and family members began asking who was contributing what. There had always been this underlying assumption that I had the means to be generous beyond measure. And, honestly, I had worked hard for what I had. But hard work and money are private matters, things you manage with care and discretion, not brag about to anyone who will listen. And yet, somehow, my supposed generosity became public knowledge before a single word left my mouth. My parents casually told everyone about my gift, as though it were an indisputable fact. The more they spoke, the heavier the lie became, until it seemed like reality. And the frustrating part? Nobody thought to ask me. Nobody looked me in the eyes and said, "Is this true?" They just nodded and applauded the story, assuming I was too modest to correct it. What really made it worse was watching how everyone responded. Relatives who rarely spoke to me now clapped me on the back. Friends who had never asked about my life suddenly approached me to praise my generosity. Even my sister, blissfully unaware of the deception, beamed when she mentioned it in casual conversations. The lie had taken on a life of its own, and it was relentless. I started noticing the way people glanced at me, expecting that quiet nod of acknowledgement, that self-effacing smile that said, "Yes, I gave the $15,000. I did my part." They weren't just wrong. They were completely and utterly wrong. And that kind of false image, the one that sticks to you and refuses to budge, has a way of eating away at you from the inside. I tried to reason with my parents at first. I mentioned casually, in conversations that seemed harmless, "Hey, you know, that figure isn't correct." And they laughed. They laughed as though it were a joke. They shrugged and said things like, "Well, everyone thinks it anyway, so why bother correcting them?" That was when I realized it wasn't just a harmless exaggeration. It was a deliberate narrative, a story they wanted everyone to believe for their own reasons. And the more I protested, the more they doubled down, as if denying it myself would make me look guilty. It was maddening. It was the kind of manipulation that feels invisible until you can't take it anymore. The idea that my reputation could be hijacked so casually, that a number, an arbitrary $15,000, could define how people saw me, lit a fire inside me. I wasn't just angry at my parents anymore. I was angry at the entire system that allowed a lie to feel real simply because everyone accepted it without question. It made me hyper-aware of every whisper, every glance, every, "Oh, you must have been so generous," comment. I started counting, mentally, how many times someone mentioned it, how many times I had to bite my tongue and nod while my stomach churned. It wasn't just about the money. It was about identity. It was about truth. As the wedding day approached, the tension inside me grew. I knew the lie would be everywhere, woven into speeches, conversations, and casual mentions as if it were a permanent fixture. I thought about standing there and letting it happen, pretending to be the generous, unseen hero of the family drama. But something inside me refused. Letting them take ownership of my story, letting them claim credit for a generosity that never existed. That was unacceptable. I realized I needed to take control of the narrative to ensure that when I finally spoke, it would leave no room for doubt. Every detail had to be perfect, every word calculated, every moment intentional. The $15,000 they claimed I gave wasn't just a number. It became a symbol of everything they had tried to control about me. The assumptions, the false praise, the image of perfection they wanted me to embody. And the more they spoke of it, the more I planned. I imagined the expressions on their faces when the truth finally came out. I imagined the sudden quiet when the myth was stripped away. I imagined my own satisfaction at reclaiming my identity in front of everyone who thought they knew me. That figure, that $15,000, had taken on a weight far beyond money. It had become the ultimate test of patience, strategy, and timing. Standing there in the months leading up to the wedding, I could almost feel the story surrounding me, the invisible chains of expectation and misrepresentation. I knew that if I didn't act, the lie would solidify into history, a permanent misconception about who I was and what I had done. And I refused to let that happen. That's when I started preparing meticulously for the speech that would finally expose the truth. Every word had to land. Every revelation had to be undeniable. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about reclaiming my story, my dignity, and the reality of my own life. The $15,000 had been their claim, but the truth would be mine. For years, I had been carrying an image that wasn't mine, an illusion carefully crafted by my parents and accepted without question by everyone around me. They painted me as the generous, selfless sibling, the one who always did the right thing, the one whose presence in the family could be counted on to save face. It wasn't just the $15,000 lie at my sister's wedding. It was the entire narrative they had built around me, as if I were a character in their personal play rather than a real person with my own thoughts, feelings, and limits. And the frustrating part? Nobody ever paused to ask if it was true. No one asked me if I even wanted to be cast in that role. They assumed I was okay with it, that I would quietly nod and accept the accolades, even if they were built on a foundation of falsehoods. At first, I tried to fit into this role, at least superficially. I smiled at compliments, nodded at the stories, and tried to go along with their expectations because I thought, maybe, it would make things easier. But the more I did it, the more suffocating it became. Every praise I received felt hollow, every nod of approval like a chain tightening around me. The generosity they credited to me was never real, yet I had to bear the weight of their story as though it were my own. It was exhausting, to be celebrated for something you had never done, to have a reputation sown from lies while everyone else enjoyed the illusion. What made it worse was the way people internalized the story. Friends, distant relatives, even casual acquaintances who barely knew me treated me differently because of this image. I would get congratulatory texts, calls, and comments, all referencing this gift I supposedly gave. And the strange thing was, when I tried to explain the truth, people didn't want to hear it. It was as if the story had become more comfortable for them than the reality. They wanted the myth, the legend of the generous sibling, because it made them feel good or maybe because it satisfied some social expectation. Their unwillingness to accept the truth only made me angrier, because my identity had been hijacked by their convenience. It wasn't just about recognition, it was about control. By presenting me as this idealized version of myself, my parents had established an invisible hierarchy. They controlled the narrative of my life, deciding what others would see, what others would believe, and what I was allowed to be. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but over time, it became glaringly obvious. They were not just lying about a $15,000 gift. They were constructing a version of me that suited their desires, their image, and their sense of family pride. My real self, the person who had her own boundaries, her own priorities, and her own struggles, had no place in that story. I started to notice the patterns. Conversations would pivot around me, not because I had done something noteworthy, but because the image they had built demanded attention. Family gatherings, casual visits, even phone calls became stages for this ongoing performance, with me cast in the role they had assigned. It wasn't subtle. Compliments were carefully timed, stories repeated with consistency, and any attempt on my part to correct or clarify was brushed aside or laughed off. I realized that correcting the story wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about reclaiming my autonomy. Every lie they told about me was a chain keeping me tethered to their narrative, and I refused to stay shackled any longer. The most painful part was the personal toll. On the surface, everything seemed fine. People admired me, congratulated me, and treated me as if I had achieved some grand act of generosity. But inside, I was frustrated, humiliated, and increasingly resentful. I wasn't asking for recognition for my accomplishments, but to have a life dictated by a false story felt like a slow, invisible erasure. Every time I heard someone mention the $15,000 or repeat another anecdote I had never lived, I felt my real self shrinking. It was as if my actual achievements, struggles, and efforts no longer mattered, because the family had decided on a more convenient truth. And the worst part? I couldn't just ignore it. I had to confront it, because the lie was becoming part of my identity in the eyes of everyone I knew. As the wedding approached, the stakes grew higher. The myth of my generosity was about to be paraded in front of a room full of people, and this time, I wouldn't be able to quietly endure it. I started to plan, thinking about how every word, every gesture, every pause in my speech could challenge the false narrative. It was not enough to merely correct the story. I had to reclaim it in a way that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind. The preparation became an obsession, a meticulous strategy to dismantle years of misrepresentation, to expose the truth, and to remind everyone that I was not a character in someone else's story. In those moments of planning, I realized something powerful. The more they tried to control how others saw me, the more control I had over the truth. Their arrogance, their assumption that everyone would accept the lie, became my advantage. I could use their overconfidence against them, using the speech as a weapon, a precise instrument of revelation. The narrative that had oppressed me for so long would crumble, not with anger, but with undeniable facts delivered calmly, confidently, and strategically. I wasn't just speaking to the room. I was reclaiming my story, my dignity, and my identity piece by piece, word by word, in front of the very people who had tried to rewrite it. Every family has its subtle digs, the little comments that sting more than anyone would admit. But in my family, those whispers and sideways glances had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. They weren't always overt. They were carefully calculated, a raised eyebrow here, a sarcastic remark there, a casual, "Oh, you probably can't handle this," tossed into conversation as though it were nothing. For years, I had endured these microattacks, pretending not to notice, shrugging them off, because what choice did I have? Questioning them would only make me appear weak or overly sensitive, and in my family, showing weakness was like waving a red flag. The digs were constant, relentless, and often cloaked in humor or affection, which made them all the more insidious. The $15,000 lie at my sister's wedding wasn't the beginning of this pattern. It was simply the most glaring example of a long-running game. Every whispered remark about my supposed gift, every casual nod to my generosity, carried an underlying current of judgment and expectation. They framed me as someone who was supposed to be perfect, someone who always met the mark, someone who could be counted on to play their version of the ideal sibling. The problem was, that ideal wasn't real. It never had been. But the digs continued, each one reinforcing the idea that if I failed to live up to their image, I was somehow lesser, inadequate, or failing them in some invisible way. It was exhausting, constantly walking on eggshells, measuring my actions and words, trying to avoid triggers that would spark another sly remark or a pointed observation. Every family gathering felt like a performance, each conversation a delicate balancing act. The subtle digs weren't just occasional. They were systemic, embedded in the way my family interacted, almost like an unspoken rule. If someone else received praise, I was compared. If someone else achieved something, I was reminded of how I should have done more, been more, or given more. The digs were not random. They were strategic, designed to keep me in my place, to reinforce the hierarchy they had created. The more I noticed them, the more aware I became of the power dynamics in the room. It wasn't just about words, it was about control. By belittling me in subtle ways, my family asserted dominance, creating an environment where I constantly questioned myself, my worth, and my actions. The $15,000 lie was part of this same system. On the surface, it appeared complimentary, a recognition of generosity, but it carried an implicit judgment. Look how much you are expected to give, how much you are supposed to do, and how you will be measured against an ideal that exists only in their imagination. Every comment, every whisper, every sideways glance was another brick in a wall designed to contain me. Over time, I realized that enduring these digs quietly was not a solution. They had become so ingrained in the family's interactions that simply ignoring them no longer felt like survival. It felt like complicity. By staying silent, I was allowing their narrative to dominate my life, shaping how others saw me and how I saw myself. The subtle digs were no longer just annoyances. They were weapons, wielded with precision, and they demanded a response. But I knew that confrontation in the heat of the moment would be reckless. These people were skilled at twisting words, turning any objection back onto me. making me look unreasonable or hypersensitive. I needed a strategy, a calculated approach that would ensure the truth was undeniable and the subtle attacks could no longer hide behind humor or affection. The wedding presented the perfect opportunity. The room would be full of people who had bought into the myth, who had participated in the quiet, insidious commentary without ever questioning it. They thought they could control the narrative, shape perceptions, and maintain the image they wanted of me. But I had been watching and listening for years. I had cataloged every remark, every laugh, every comment that implied something less than flattering about me, and I had stored them all, not with bitterness, but with focus. The subtle digs that once made me feel small would now be confronted indirectly, through the power of truth and careful timing. My words would not just counter the lie, they would illuminate the pattern, exposing the entire mechanism of manipulation. I imagined standing in front of the room, the collective expectation weighing on my shoulders. Every face would carry some form of anticipation, whether admiration for my supposed generosity or curiosity about what I would say. I planned my words meticulously, choosing phrasing that would reveal the truth without unnecessary cruelty, but still sharp enough to pierce the carefully constructed veil of judgment. Every anecdote I shared, every subtle revelation I dropped, was designed to counter the years of whispers and sideways glances, to assert that I was no longer a passive participant in a story that wasn't mine. As the day approached, the anticipation became almost unbearable. The subtle digs that had haunted me for years were about to be met with a force they hadn't anticipated: clarity and control. I envisioned the subtle shifts in expressions, the faint flinches, the quiet recognition that the person they thought they could measure, judge, and control had finally taken the stage to speak for themselves. These small attacks, once invisible and demoralizing, would be rendered powerless in the face of deliberate, undeniable truth. I realized that the speech would be more than just a correction of the $15,000 lie. It would be an exposure of the subtle system of judgment and expectation that had shaped my life for so long. Every rehearsal, every adjustment, every imagined reaction added to my confidence. The subtle digs that once forced me to shrink, to doubt, and to question would now become the backdrop against which I reclaimed my identity. I wasn't seeking revenge in a petty way. I was reclaiming the dignity and control that had been stolen from me through years of manipulation, whispers, and assumptions. The wedding speech would be the turning point, the moment when the quiet, calculated attacks finally met their match, and the truth could no longer be denied. The wedding day finally arrived, and with it, the weight of anticipation pressed down on me like a physical force. I could feel every eye in the room, every expectation that had been built up over the years, all converging on me in that moment. It wasn't just about my sister's big day anymore. It was about every misrepresentation, every whisper, every sideways glance that had been directed at me throughout my life. I had rehearsed my words, planned my pauses, calculated the moments when I would let silence speak louder than any accusation. And yet, standing there, the enormity of what I was about to do hit me in waves. The room was filled with smiles, laughter, clinking glasses, and congratulations, but underneath it all, I could feel the invisible chains of expectation and misconception tightening, ready to be broken by the truth I carried with me. From the very first steps into the reception hall, I noticed it. The subtle shifts in attention as people recognized me, the nods acknowledging the generosity that had never existed, the assumptions about who I was and what I had done. They didn't know the truth. They had no idea that the $15,000 gift, so confidently attributed to me, was a fabrication. And in that moment, I realized how powerful this knowledge was. It was a secret weapon, a piece of armor I could wear invisibly while they remained blind, completely unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. The irony was delicious. Everyone in the room believed they were in control of the narrative, yet they had no idea that I had been quietly strategizing for months, preparing to reclaim my story, one carefully chosen word at a time. As the speeches began, I felt my heartbeat quicken, not with nervousness, but with anticipation. Every compliment and anecdote about my supposed generosity felt like a trigger, reminding me of the years I had endured misrepresentation and assumption. I had listened quietly as family after family spoke, nodding along, concealing the fire that had been building inside me. And now, finally, it was my turn. I could feel the energy of the room shifting, the subtle undercurrent of expectation thickening. They thought they were about to hear another polite, gracious acknowledgement, perhaps even a few gentle jokes about my legendary gift. But they were about to discover a different kind of speech, one that would not just celebrate my sister's day, but illuminate the truth that had been ignored for far too long. When I began to speak, I chose my words carefully, letting each one land with precision. I didn't rush, because the power of timing was crucial. Pauses were my allies. Silence was my weapon. I spoke first of my sister, of the love and happiness surrounding her, setting the tone of celebration. Then, almost imperceptibly, I began weaving in the subtle truths that had been ignored, the facts that contradicted the story everyone had accepted without question. Every anecdote, every carefully framed detail, chipped away at the myth that had been constructed around me. I could see the faint furrowing of brows, the quiet glances exchanged between relatives, the first signs of unease as they realized that this speech was not going to follow the script they had anticipated. The beauty of the moment was in the contrast between expectation and reality. They had built a narrative in which I was the generous, unerring sibling, the one who had done it all, without ever seeking recognition. And here I was, calmly, deliberately dismantling that narrative, revealing the truth in a way that was undeniable but not unnecessarily cruel. Every revelation was like a controlled explosion, a small shock that rippled through the room. The silence that followed each admission was deafening, louder than any applause could ever be. People were trying to process the information, to reconcile what they thought they knew with the reality I was presenting. And in that tension, I found a quiet satisfaction. For years, I had been silenced, misrepresented, and judged. Now, finally, I had the floor, the power, and the truth on my side. I could see it in the eyes of my parents, the very people who had orchestrated the $15,000 myth, the ones who had assumed they could control how the world perceived me. There was a flicker of surprise, a hint of discomfort, as if the carefully constructed image of their perfect, generous child was crumbling before them. I didn't need to raise my voice or point fingers. The truth, presented calmly and confidently, was enough to undo years of assumption. And as the room adjusted to this new reality, I realized the profound impact of claiming my narrative. It wasn't about humiliation for the sake of revenge. It was about justice, clarity, and reclaiming my identity from the shadows of someone else's lies. Every subtle dig, every whispered comment, every sideways glance that had marked my life now took on new meaning in the context of my speech. They had been warnings, indicators, and challenges, but they were also fuel for the moment I had been preparing for. By speaking, I was converting their attempts to diminish me into a demonstration of my own power and resilience. I had endured their control, their manipulation, and their assumptions, but now I was turning it back on them, not with malice, but with undeniable truth and careful articulation. As the speech progressed, I could sense the shift in the room. The energy changed from celebration to tension, from expectation to contemplation. Every subtle reaction, every quick exchange of glances, was evidence that the narrative I had been denied for so long was finally being restored. The room, filled with family and friends, was witnessing a transformation, one that had been long overdue. They had expected politeness, humor, or humility. Instead, they received clarity, confidence, and the revelation that the story they had accepted without question was, in fact, fiction. Turning a celebratory speech into a moment of reckoning was something I had never imagined doing, yet it felt inevitable the closer I got to that stage. Weddings are supposed to be about joy, laughter, and celebration, but for me, it had become an opportunity to confront a narrative that had been forced upon me for years. The $15,000 gift myth was only the tip of the iceberg. It represented everything that had been assumed, manipulated, and misrepresented about me. The speech wasn't just about acknowledging my sister and her happiness. It was about reclaiming control, asserting the truth, and finally showing the room that the story they had embraced was not my story at all. I realized that this single moment, this carefully timed and measured speech, could redefine the way everyone in that room saw me, and I intended to make it count. The preparation had been painstaking. I considered every phrase, every pause, every subtle shift in tone. The words had to balance honesty with tact, revelation with respect, clarity with impact. I knew that if I rushed, if I allowed anger or resentment to spill unchecked, the speech would lose power. I needed precision, a deliberate cadence that would allow the room to absorb each revelation, to react naturally, and to feel the weight of the truth settling into place. And most importantly, I needed to maintain composure, because control of emotion is the silent weapon in any battle of perception. The more calm and collected I appeared, the more undeniable the truth became, and the more the audience would have no choice but to confront it. The moment I stepped up to speak, I felt the shift in energy immediately. The chatter died down, conversations paused mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to me. I could feel the anticipation, the unspoken curiosity, the unrecognized tension in the air. They expected a speech filled with light humor, polite praise, and perhaps a nod to the family dynamics. What they didn't expect was the undercurrent of revelation I had woven into every sentence, every anecdote, every carefully chosen word. The room was about to witness a transformation, not just in the narrative of the gift, but in the narrative of my life. And that realization gave me a quiet, almost intoxicating sense of power. I started the speech in the traditional way, acknowledging my sister, sharing memories, celebrating the union, and setting a tone of warmth and affection. It was important to establish that I was there for her happiness, that my focus wasn't on drama or revenge, but on truth and clarity. This approach made the next part, the revelation, hit harder. The contrast between expectation and reality amplified every reaction, every pause, every gasp. As I slowly and deliberately introduced the facts that contradicted the long-held belief of my $15,000 gift, I could see subtle changes in posture, slight twitches, and the first flickers of discomfort. It was fascinating and satisfying to watch the room process the truth, to see them adjust to a reality that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. Each revelation was layered, building on the previous one, creating a crescendo that demanded attention. I didn't need to shout, point fingers, or attack anyone personally. The strength was in the calm delivery, in the precision of the facts, and in the undeniable logic of my words. They had woven a story around me, assigning a generosity that didn't exist, shaping perceptions to fit their narrative. Now, one word at a time, I was dismantling it. The silence that followed each subtle revelation was more powerful than applause, more effective than anger. It allowed the truth to resonate, giving each listener space to process their assumptions and confront their complicity. I could see the effects most vividly in my parents' expressions. The smug confidence, the self-assured smiles, the subtle pride in their control, all of it was eroding with every word I spoke. Their realization that the story they had presented as truth was a fabrication created a tension that was palpable, almost electric. It wasn't about humiliation, though there was an undeniable satisfaction in watching their carefully constructed narrative unravel. It was about reclaiming my identity, asserting the reality of my life, and demonstrating that no one, not even family, could dictate the truth about me without consequence. The subtle shifts in the room weren't limited to my parents. Relatives, friends, and even casual acquaintances were caught in the same wave of realization. People whispered to each other, glanced at me with a new awareness, and adjusted their understanding in real time. The speech had transformed from a celebration into a revelation, a recalibration of perception that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The power of reclaiming my narrative lay not just in what I said, but in the collective recognition that the room had been operating under a falsehood for years, and that I was now in control of the story. As I continued, I wove in examples, memories, and moments that illustrated the broader pattern of misrepresentation, not just the $15,000 lie. I highlighted the assumptions, the whispers, and the expectations that had shaped my interactions, emphasizing how they had been both subtle and pervasive. The audience could feel the tension, could see the threads of manipulation and expectation that had woven their way through family dynamics. And the most satisfying part was that they couldn't argue against it. Facts, careful recollection, and deliberate delivery left no room for denial, no space for excuses, and no avenue for deflection. The power of truth, I realized, was absolute when wielded with control and intention. Every pause, every breath, every carefully timed anecdote amplified the effect. I had turned a moment of celebration into a stage for accountability, clarity, and empowerment. The room, filled with people who had long assumed they understood my role, my actions, and my character, was now adjusting to a reality they hadn't anticipated. And as I spoke, I felt a deep, grounding sense of satisfaction, not just for the moment, but for the reclamation of my story, the acknowledgement of my truth, and the undeniable evidence that control of narrative is never permanent when confronted with confidence, clarity, and courage. The silence that followed my words was more powerful than any applause could have been. For years, I had endured whispers, assumptions, and misrepresentations, and now, in that moment, the room was forced to confront the truth without distraction, without the comfort of conversation or diversion. It wasn't just quiet, it was a tangible pause, a collective holding of breath as each person processed the reality I had laid out. The $15,000 lie, the subtle digs, the carefully constructed narrative of who I was supposed to be, all of it had led to this instant. And in that silence, I could feel the weight of justice, clarity, and reclamation settle over the room, more potent than any applause or cheer could ever convey. Silence has a strange power. It magnifies tension, highlights contradictions, and makes the truth unavoidable. In that pause, no one could hide behind assumptions or laughter. They couldn't gloss over the reality of the story I had revealed. Every eye that had once smiled at the legend of my generosity now reflected curiosity, shock, or even a hint of discomfort. The room was no longer a collection of passive observers. It had become an arena for acknowledgement, for reckoning, and for reflection. I realized, in that very instant, that silence could communicate more than words ever could. It held attention, demanded contemplation, and, above all, underscored the gravity of truth. I watched my parents' faces, a mixture of surprise, unease, and perhaps a fleeting recognition of their own overconfidence. The persona they had crafted for me, the image of perfect generosity they had advertised to the world, was crumbling before them. Their silence was not polite. It was the sound of confrontation without words, of authority being quietly challenged, and of assumptions being irrevocably dismantled. They had spent years trying to control the narrative, assuming they could define my character, dictate my actions, and shape how others perceived me. Yet here I stood, calm, composed, and undeniably in control of the truth, forcing them to acknowledge the reality they had ignored for so long. The silence extended beyond my parents. Relatives who had repeated the story, cousins who had nodded along with the myth, friends who had assumed my generosity without question, they all experienced the same weight. The collective pause transformed the room, reshaping the energy from casual celebration into a space of reflection. Each person had to process what they had assumed, what they had believed, and what they now understood. And as they did, the power of my words resonated not just as correction, but as revelation. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with recognition, contemplation, and the undeniable realization that the truth cannot be denied when delivered with precision, confidence, and integrity. In that quiet, I could feel the shift within myself as well. For years, I had carried the burden of their assumptions, their fabricated stories, and their subtle manipulations. I had smiled, nodded, and endured, often feeling invisible beneath the weight of a narrative I had never agreed to. But in this moment, the silence affirmed my own agency. It validated my experiences, my perspective, and my patience. Every pause, every breath, every measured word had contributed to this moment of undeniable impact. The power of truth, when wielded deliberately, had transformed the room, reshaped perceptions, and restored control over my story in a way that nothing else could. I noticed the subtle but unmistakable reactions, a nervous shift in a chair, a quick glance exchanged between cousins, a fleeting tightening of a smile that had been confident moments before. Each small movement confirmed what I had known all along, that the narrative they had relied upon was fragile, dependent on assumption and repetition, and easily dismantled when met with clarity and truth. Silence had become my ally, magnifying the effect of every revelation, every correction, and every assertion of reality. It created a space in which reflection replaced pretense and recognition replaced assumption. As I continued, I allowed pauses to linger just long enough to let the weight of each fact settle. I didn't rush to fill the room with words, because silence has its own authority. It forces attention, emphasizes significance, and creates a rhythm that words alone cannot achieve. Each revelation, followed by a moment of quiet, reinforced the impact of what had been said and ensured that the audience could not simply ignore it. The subtle tension in the room became a testament to the effectiveness of deliberate, measured delivery. It was more than just a reaction. It was a mirror reflecting the consequences of their assumptions, their overconfidence, and their misjudgments. The silence also created a collective introspection. People were no longer thinking about the party, the celebration, or the usual wedding chatter. They were processing the story, evaluating their own complicity, and reconsidering the perceptions they had held about me for years. The pause forced them to confront the truth in a way that immediate reaction or applause never could. It was uncomfortable, deliberate, and undeniable, a perfect reflection of the weight of years of misrepresentation and expectation. And in that charged stillness, I felt the culmination of patience, preparation, and strategy. I realized that silence, in its own way, was more punishing than any words could be. It demanded attention, reflection, and acknowledgement. It exposed the fragility of assumptions and revealed the potency of truth delivered with control. Every whisper, every subtle dig, every misrepresentation that had once been brushed off or ignored now met the quiet, immovable force of reality. The room, once filled with expectation and assumption, was now a witness to clarity, to justice, and to the undeniable restoration of my narrative.